Hey guys, we are back with our fourth video from chapter 3 of our textbook over ecology. We're talking about the biosphere. We just got done last video talking about terrestrial biomes, so things like the tropical rainforest or temperate grasslands or the tundra. And we went through each one of those and talked about its abiotic and its biotic factors. But as you know, a lot of the globe is covered by water. Um, and so there are aquatic ecosystems that we need to discuss as well. So we're going to take a shot at some of those aquatic ecosystems here today. So looking first at the marine, that's the saltwater, guys. Understanding how aquatic ecosystems are characterized. So they're characterized by their salinity, which is their amount of salt. They're characterized by their depth. So if you can see on this chart, there are different zones. Things like the photic zone and the aphotic zone, which is where the light reaches versus where the light doesn't reach, the benthic zone, which is the very bottom of the ocean. You've got the intertidal zone, which is where the tide raises from high tide, where water is covering at a high tide, to low tide, where this is exposed to the air. You've got the coastal zone, which is the continental shelf, and it's got things like the coral reef, and then you've got the big drop into the open ocean where you have the photic and aphotic zones. It's also characterized by its temperature, so obviously where light reaches is going to be warmer, or where there are thermal vents it might be warm, but in those areas in the middle where there is no light it's going to be cooler. Flow rate, which is the movement of water, and then concentration of nutrients. And so where the nutrients are at characterizes marine ecosystems as well. So just a couple that we're going to talk about. First of all, the intertidal zone. I mentioned that just a second ago. Intertidal zones are submerged in seawater when they're at high tide. So high tide, when the tide is coming in, the water level increases on the coast. High tide, those areas are covered, so they're underwater. But at low tide, those areas would be exposed to the air. And so these organisms are going to experience an extreme change in temperature. They're going to be battered by waves. They're going to feel currents, but they're also going to have air at points during the day. So many of these are rocky, and the organisms there attach themselves to the rocks so that they don't get pulled away with the tide or moved. And this typically exists in temperate regions where they're exposed. So what you see are a lot of seaweeds and barnacles or things that are common here. You've got crabs and all of those organisms, but these are characteristic of when the tide is high, they're underwater, and when the tide is low, they're exposed. Which brings us to our coastal ocean. The coastal ocean begins at the low tide mark. So where low tide is at, that's where coastal ocean begins, and it extends to the outer edge of the continental shelf, which is the relatively shallow border that surrounds the continents. Think about the tectonic plate or the the shelf that continents are on. When you hit the end of that shelf, it's going to be the end of the coastal ocean. Water here is going to be lit. It's going to be having sunlight travel through it, and so it's going to have nutrients being supplied to it as well because it's coastal from freshwater runoff from land, so you'll have high amounts of nutrients. And so you tend to see pretty productive areas. Things like kelp forests and coral reefs are incredibly important coastal ecosystems that you see. And as we know, coral reefs are undergoing some changes and bleaching based on some of those nutrients that are coming out of freshwater systems. And then the third ocean one, or the final ocean one, is the open ocean, and that begins at the end of the continental shelf and extends outward. Roughly 90% of the world's ocean is considered open ocean. It's going to range in depth depending from like 500 meters deep all the way to thousands and 10,000 meters deep. And we divide the open ocean into what we call photic and aphotic zones. So the photic zone gets sunlight, but it's going to typically have low nutrients because most nutrients don't rise to the top. So you see a lot of photosynthesis here, but not a lot of other productivity. So phytoplankton are going to be what you see at the photic zone. In the aphotic zone, it's going to be dark. There's no sunlight coming through, including the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. No photosynthesis can occur here. These deep ocean organisms are exposed to very high pressure from the amount of water that's above them. They're very cold temperatures. And what we have found as you dive deep down, and we have what are called deep sea vents, which are locations where this superheated boiling water comes out of cracks from the inner parts of the earth, which supports life on the ocean floor, which uses chemical energy instead of sun energy. And so that's sort of the sections of the ocean that you need to know. Which brings us to freshwater ecosystems. And something that's important to understand about freshwater ecosystems is that only 3% of water on Earth is considered freshwater. And so we're working with a very small percentage, and these are your rivers and streams, your lakes and ponds, and your wetlands. So some characteristics about rivers and streams. They're going to have typically a source, so a specific location that water is flowing from, whether it's coming from out of the ground or excuse me, yeah, whether it's coming out of the ground or some other source, but it has a specific source, and you're going to see high oxygen levels near that source. And as you move farther downstream, you're going to see sediment build up. And remember, sediment are those small particles that are being broken down, typically rocks and debris and dirt and things like that. They're going to move with the flow of the water and get caught up downstream. So you'll see sediment built up downstream. And this is where plants will establish themselves, is farther downstream. And so typically what you see with rivers and streams is that they're going to begin inland and flow out toward the oceans. Most of them reach the ocean, some dry up before then. Then you've got lakes and ponds, and lakes and ponds is greatly dependent on the algae and plankton present in the lake. Sometimes water can flow in and out of ponds and lakes. You can have streams or rivers that bring water in and out of lakes. And then an important characteristic with lakes and ponds is they can flip. And so what we mean by that is that during some seasons, with the changing temperature of the water between summer and winter and fall and things like that, warm water and cold water can mix and circulate and draw up nutrients from the bottom of the lakes and ponds to the top. And it's this really important redistribution of nutrients that keeps the lakes and ponds productive. But it's all based on the temperature of water and the cycling of that warm and cold water that brings up those nutrients. And then you've got wetlands, and wetlands are characterized by water being above or at the level of the soil. And wetlands play this incredible role in purifying water. So wetlands can pull out pollutants because they're purifying the water, and they can also create these important boundaries to help prevent flooding because they can absorb so much water. So wetlands are this incredible productive resource for us in absorbing and storing large amounts of fresh water, as well as purifying it and removing those pollutants that are harmful to us. So as we lose wetlands, we're losing this key resource for purifying and storing fresh water. And I want to end today by talking about something called an estuary. And an estuary is specifically a wetland where fresh and salt water mix at the edge of the ocean. So basically, you've got fresh water coming from a stream or a lake or a river, and it's mixing with the salt water of the ocean. And so you have this interesting dynamic of salinity where it's not as salty as the ocean, but you're mixing fresh water with salt water. And so it's this really important spawning ground for important fish and shellfish. And so we're talking about um, your bass, your crabs, bluefish are all these important fishing or food fish, commercial fish for us to eat and everything. And this is an important spawning ground for all of those. And you also have something called mangroves. And mangroves are this interconnected network of trees that grow out of the water, and they provide this incredibly important boundary that protects shorelines from erosion. And so you have these waves coming in from the ocean, obviously, but these trees sort of absorb that and knock down those waves and prevent the shoreline from being eroded with their presence. And so estuaries are another key important resource for us to maintain. But I know this was really brief, but I just wanted to hit on some of the some of the fresh and saltwater ecosystems that you'll need to know. So far we've covered the biosphere, we've talked about climate and weather, we've talked about the terrestrial and aquatic biomes that there are on the planet. Thanks for listening.